Okay, so Sorensen's model of rent-based exploitation. Sorensen endorses the idea that exploitation means there is a causal connection between the advantage and disadvantage of two classes. Good, we agree with that. This creates latent antagonistic interest, which, when acted upon as a result of the development of class consciousness, creates class conflict.
I don't disagree with that necessarily. I don't know if I agree with it.
Yeah, let's just keep going. The pivot of this definition is the idea of antagonistic interests. Interests may be said to be antagonistic when the gain of one or a set of actors excludes others from gaining the same advantage. So zero-sum game type of shit. And finally, this exploitation-centered concept of class sees class relations as structured by processes of exploitation which causally generate antagonistic interests. Like to this, I think, like I kind of commented at the end, like is not the antagonism already there before the exploitation occurs? You know, if we're thinking about that kind of stuff that Kyle was always going on about Weberian, you know, the initial thing is the take of the land. You exclude them from, you know, it's an exclusion thing. So you have this like class dynamic before you have exploitation. You have this antagonism. So I don't know what people think about that.
Well, I think that's a chicken and the egg problem, which, I mean, I think really, like, I don't think you can really have antagonistic, like, so you mean like initial endowments may be antagonistic given the possibility space for each actor, right? Like the choices they can make are weighted towards antagonism prior to actually acting on it, is what you're saying, Tom?
Say like the English invade Ireland and they take your land, and there's an antagonism there right before they ever get the Irish working for them and exploiting them.
That is exploitation.
Taking the land.
It's zero sum.
No, well, taking the land is not exploitation. That's
no,
like
it's direct.
That would be Sorensen exploitation.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is by Sorensen's definition, expropriation of land is exploitation. It's zero sum action.
Okay, sorry.
In Marxist, we would not call it.
It's an enclosure of assets which can generate an income stream. So
take the point. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
But I think we have to this is where we have to talk about what Marx means by exploitation as opposed to what everyone else does, because who knows what everyone else means actually, because it's a vague term. But like Marxist exploitation actually defines itself against that in specific, because that is direct. That's direct expropriation. It doesn't involve free labor. It does
there's not a continuous relationship. You can take it. You can kill them all.
Yeah, that's the point he gets into. It's probably worth dwelling on. It's some detail.
But let's go on.
Let's go on. Okay, who wants to take this bit?
I can read it.
Go, Kyle. Go.
Instead of basing exploitation within Marx's labor theory of value, he proposes a simple alternative, identifying exploitation with economic rents. Owning assets give people a stream of income when they are deployed in production or exchange in the market. Okay, so this is Tom's editorializing. As if workers rent the assets from the capitalists to make shit. Lol. Happens in some cases, not very many. But okay, so yeah, anyway, let's keep going. The value of the asset is defined by the total returns one obtains from it during the period one owns it. Any return to the asset above those conditions of quote-unquote perfect competition is a rent. Perfect competition is defined as requiring perfect information and an absence of any power relations between actors within a market. That's actually not a sufficient definition of perfect competition, but it's the one that is the outer doctrine that you get from neoclassicals, which is probably absurd, but nonetheless more plausible than what is actually required for perfect competition.
What did they say internally, Kyle? Do you want to?
I can read it. I can read it out to you. I got all the conditions. I posted them to chat the other day.
Do it.
All right. So here are the actual necessities for perfect competition. Number one, you must have a large number of buyers and sellers, none powerful enough to appreciably affect the market. That's the point about absence of any power relations. 2, ease of any business firm to enter or exit any industry. We completely ignore any of the actual characteristics of any field of production, given on the peculiarities of the means of production needed, timescales, any of that kind of thing. 3, homogeneous inputs and outputs, each divisible into units of any desired size. So again, industries have no inherent qualities to them. They are simply just infinitely divisible continuum with no properties. No uncertainty about the future. So that means also the corollary to that is that we have to abolish the existence of time. Yeah, that is perfect information. Yes. All those things are implied in perfect information. Perfect knowledge of all possible alternatives in production and consumption, again, requires the abolition of time, because it's impossible to have perfect knowledge of all those alternatives without knowing the outcomes. Production functions having the appropriate second-order optimality conditions, in quotes, i.e. of being of smooth curvature, not having increasing returns to scale, and having diminishing marginal rates of substitution along any isoquant curve. I mean, there are so many problems there, I could barely even begin to describe them. It's you have to have a perfect schedule of everything you could possibly consume in the universe, and none of those things can be in a inconsistent ordering. It's also, necessary that everything follows the law of diminishing returns, law in scare quotes, which is not observable in reality. Okay, anyway, that's just a dogma. Similarly appropriate utility functions that are stable over time. Again, doesn't matter because time doesn't exist. Productivity that is generally unaffected by the distribution of wealth, income, and power. So, I mean, the idea of having money and therefore being able to invest more and therefore getting greater productivity is abolished because, of course, all the endowments are equal for everyone. Only those external economies and diseconomies, or externalities, that can be corrected or nullified with taxes, subsidies, or the creation of new property rights. So anything that is an externality for example, if carbon credits cannot actually deal with the externality, quote unquote, problems of CO2 usage, they have to be abolished from reality because they don't follow into the perfect little sphere where you have government technocrats who can just like 100% effectively correct any of these problems. And 10, markets that are always in equilibrium with all change represented as instantaneous shifts from one static equilibrium situation to another. Again, abolition of time, abolition of space, because they're instantaneous shifts, which means that you're basically looking at utterly isolated slices of time that don't have any continuity, which is, of course, contrary to even like weirdo theories of time like you get in general relativity. So
we spent a whole reading group shitting on static equilibrium, which, by the way, now that I'm in a math degree, it's just like go Google like comparative statics. You only get economics because all the other fields that did comparative statics got into dynamics and just did what adults would do with dynamics, right?
Like how long ago as well? How long ago are we talking like dynamics?
This is the 70s, 80s, like especially as computation picks up in the 90s, like forget about it.
Yeah, or even just, stuff like difference equations and stuff like that. That is around fucking ages. It's fucking ages.
The first critics of neoclassicals, the first serious critics of neoclassicals are physicists. Straight down the line. And the neoclassical economists were fucking wannabe physicists. That's the fucking. And then the physicists saw it and went, "What's this dumb shit?
What is this bullshit?" Yeah. No,
there's records of physicists writing letters to Jevons, being like, "This doesn't work. Like your math doesn't work. This doesn't make sense," and he just ignored them. So
let us make stated once we have cleared that even the most maximalist vision of communism does not meet the utopian batshittery of perfect competition under market conditions and general equilibrium. I just want that to be stated because it's insane what it requires.
What it requires is
It-
basically a universe that is static with like blobs of like fucking. It's a black hole. Basically a black hole is what it requires.
A black hole's more. The math is more interesting than the black hole.
yeah. You actually
There's like differential geometry going on there.
They've proved that what is it? Black holes leak information.
But
So,
not
yeah.
classical economics. I know.
Yeah.
I know.
What it is actually describing is God. It's describing God. That's what it is. Because
God is a neoclassical. Fuck.
I mean, it's describing that idea of God as sort of a isolated perfection from the world that is utterly unitary. Because when you talk about the homogeneous inputs and outputs, you talk about the preference schedules, what you end up coming to is that a neoclassical market can only actually operate with an individual. It doesn't actually work with more than one person in it. So it's totally fucked.
And tell us again about like about the academy standards where this becomes the dominant school. Is there something going on there outside of the argument? I'm joking. You know what I mean? It shows you
pretty straightforward. Like it's ideology.
It's ideology straight down the line. Yeah.
It's also like, I think based on my study of this in history of economics, my opinion is that there are distinctive layers of motivation that you have to think about in the academy between professional interest and the general ideological political interest. And one of the things is that neoclassical, like, you know, the big coup for neoclassicals was in America, and they unseated the institutionalists as the dominant economists. And I think the main thing there is not only, it's not only that their ideology was compatible with capitalism, because a lot of these people actually had socialistic political backgrounds, much more so to the left. Like, okay, let me make this clear. The people who came from Austria were completely ostracized in Austria from the academy because they were too left-wing. That was an ideological divide. But when they came to America, initially, before McCarthyism, the Americans didn't really care about that. And what they actually were interested in was that these people had serious engineer brain and they were extremely mathy. And that was very gee whiz to everybody. That's more why the institutionalists got kicked out than them having an ideological advantage.
Do not trust engineer brain. I've been saying this for like 4 years, and I know we're a pro science podcast,
but anti-engineer. Yeah,
but we are anti-engineering.
I'm comfortable with this.
I think I would say I'm engineering skeptical.
Kyle,
yeah.
How much was the institutionalists? How much were they a fitting economic ideology for a kind of growing state, like a developing state like the Americans? And when they became the top dog, they didn't want institutionalism, and here's the next best dog on the track. It's
a little bit complicated. You certainly have a number of them who are influenced by Dewey and by Veblen in big ways, and have a kind of left critique and are critical of, kind of in a similar way to like Habermas, of bureaucratized modern society and the power relations that are involved there. But I wouldn't say, basically, I could see a path forward for institutionalism that was more or less identical to what you get in business school in America these days, as opposed to what you get in an economics department, which is neoclassical. So yeah, so I don't think there was an inherent antagonism there.
Do you want to do the last part here of this slide, Kyle, after all of that?
Oh yeah, sorry about that. So I hope that everyone now is better, has a better understanding of why this stuff is all like so deeply offensive and gaslighty. Like, you know, anyone who was taught this stuff as truth in Econ 101 probably shares my feelings of having been gaslit by these people and holds a considerable grudge against them.
Yeah, I was good at this in Econ 101 and Econ 102.
Yeah, same.
Tried to recruit me, and now I'm pissed. I'm so mad. Like,
Yeah, I drank the Kool-Aid.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't, and it I had a hard time with all this stuff, and I realized after a while that I just had to do flashcards of memorizing how they said things worked. And I was like, this isn't biology. Like, why am I learning this fucking fake shit? This is way before I was a Marxist. I was like, this isn't science.
Yeah,
there's numbers in it. But
I did a pure maths degree, and you could do a few different courses, and I did one in mathematical economics with one of the mathematicians from the engineering or the economics department, and he's coming in with these supply demand curves and some of this fucking, this one's concave and this one's convex, and we're just like going like, this isn't fucking, it's hardly math. Yeah, it's not science. It's just fucking wow. It's just, we were all just like looking at each other going, what the fuck is this shit? You know?
Yes. So just to double down on this a little more, and then we can move on. But like, I also, like, Esri broke with this before, not as early, but before I was a Marxist. But it was because I would notice things like they would use equilibrium and demand and risk curves to justify, like, it's safer to have cars with spikes on the wheel. That was a real argument, really made in a real Economics 101 text by the armchair economist. And then they mapped it out on like a risk versus caution reward leading to better driving in abstract. And then I started reading von Mises stuff, which admittedly that's like not even truly neoclassical. It's Austrian, but I would notice that the same journal would use the same inputs to argue two completely opposite points with the same like market dynamics involved. And I was like, you can't do that if this means anything. Like, you can't. This is a framework where the conclusions are pretty much whatever you fucking want them to be.
So I learned neoclassical econ in undergrad, did my first year of it, wasn't a math or science guy. I just happened to be good at this stuff. And then when I actually, I studied Harvey and essentially just continued to read Harvey from a neoclassical perspective, which is totally harmonious with his perspective. And then when I got into grad school and was studying history of economics, I had to go through, like, I would say probably a year or so of intensive self-study to deprogram my brain, because I couldn't read other schools of economics and not read their terminology from a neoclassical perspective. That was just like the goggles I had on to understand any school of economics. So everything I read about classical economics just looked like nonsense to me. And then I had to go back and read Marx and deprogram the Harvey reading of Marx from my brain. So I feel like there's just so many levels of gaslighting that you could go through with this shit. And to your point, Derek, I had a total crisis of faith in economics as a pursuit at all, because every school of economics has incompatible conclusions, and they have no interest in actually working towards any kind of resolution of those disagreements.
I've heard of beer goggles at the end of the night when you're out in your pit. But like neoclassical goggles, that's a new one.
Yeah, it was neoclassical goggles. Okay, I'll finish reading now. So Sorensen then proposes restricting exploitation to inequality generated by ownership or possession of rent-producing assets. Rent-producing assets or resources create inequalities where the advantage to the owner is obtained at the expense of the non-owners. These non-owners would be better off if the rent-producing asset was redistributed or eliminated. So again, it kind of follows then that in perfect competition, there would be no exploitation, because the distribution of assets would be perfect and there would be no barriers to entry, no sort of like effects on productivity according to XYZ. So yeah, it's pretty much like this is a thing that it doesn't exist in perfect competition, but does exist in the real world.
Okay. Who wants to take on some of these startling conclusions?
I think I'll take these on. Because I just want to say, when you look at the assumptions, like, okay, yeah, all the perfect competition stuff is nuts. But if you just look at, well, if there's a, there's an asset and an income stream, maybe people would be better off if these things were, redistributed or eliminated. You think, oh, well, all right, okay. But then you look at the conclusions that can be derived from these premises, and I think you got, perhaps why neoclassicals like redefining exploitation and being rigorous about it to an extent, and then allowing these conclusions to slip through. Are we ready?
Hit it.
We're ready. Some startling conclusions of exploitation as rent. Capitalist property relations by themselves do not generate classes. A capitalist market economy with perfect competition would be a classless society, since it places the nexus of the problem in structures, not relations. So, yeah, neoclassical utopia. 2, when unions negotiate solidarity wages, where wage differentials are reduced by raising the wages of unskilled workers, unskilled workers become an exploiting class. Unions can create substantial rents to low-skilled or otherwise less productive workers. Okay,
Oh,
so
God. I can't even manage to shut my mouth here. But like, it's like talking about mixing up like key, from a Marxist point of view, which honestly, right, it's going to actually buy in and use the language of these economic rents of workers by reducing your exploitation is somehow a rent. Like, he uses their language and he talks about it in that language. It's kind of I find it very hard to take, Esri, I'm going to say in this chapter.
But he says, but those rents are mitigating actual exploitation.
Well, why call them fucking rents then? Don't call them rents. He concedes even the language.
I don't think that's so bad, honestly. I think calling the rent that you're trying to defend your labor exploitation from exploitation is fucking traitorous. That's traitorous.
It's not a fucking rent.
I don't care what it is. Like when you're thinking about the problem of global proletarian class composition, and you then look at what workers do on the national level to protect their interests, and then how that affects the global proletariat, you're going to start talking about rents. Okay? And I don't have a problem with this. I think
but it's not. It isn't a rent. I actually do have a problem with
I think getting too hung up on this means that
come on now, Esri. Let's come on now. Where is our fucking analytical Marxism clarity of fucking definitions?
Like, you're gonna get all hazy on definitions because it's convenient to do so.
I just don't have a position on this where I care deeply about it. Like I don't,
because if you have that as a rent, then anything that is not direct commodity production exchange can be said to be a rent. Anything.
Yeah, but if it's not if that's not exploitation, and there's no moral, I don't know, there's no moral component to thinking about rents, who gives a shit what you call it?
Well, because Marx has a whole different argument against rents.
Because rent and exploitation are different qualities. They're different. It's like saying, well, we might as well.
Do you think that? Hold on a second. Do you think that Wright agrees with this argument that these rents are exploitation?
I'm saying that he concedes the use of the term rent for something which is not a rent, and I think even conceding the language. Even though he makes the point at the end, he concedes that fucking language. And I think that's shoddy workmanship, Ted. Shoddy workmanship.
No, he takes on neoclassical assumptions. That's what he's doing here. I just
want to say that Sorensen's argument here is pretty much indistinguishable from the classical liberals like Pareto and Mises and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is straight down the line. This is it's just a really normal usage of rent. I think, this is not Marx's definition of rent.
But it's not even Wright's definition of rent. And he doesn't use it anyway. I think it's hard to read the latter parts of this book. And
I don't even to be completely fair to you, I don't know if Wright takes on a neoclassical definition of rent. Like I think that he concedes in this chapter. Because,
yeah, that's what I meant. I mean the chapter, not the
Yeah.
book. I mean the chapter, not the book. Yeah, I missed it.
Yeah. I did read this chapter as if he was conceding, but if I read the previous chapter like that, then I would think Wright is a methodological individualist because he's, defending a neoclassical.
Yeah, which is what we all thought reading the chapter. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I don't even really. I don't find taking like a position on whether that's a rent or not to be super enlightening. I think what he does with it is pretty interesting. That if you add this additional, because he cares about exploitation, right? And you want to talk about fucking rents, whatever. Like, let's talk about appropriation of labor effort as our like central, our central mechanism of exploitation.
You're convincing me that this book is anti-systemic. That like I have to take each chapter sui generously to itself and not connect it to the prior or next chapter or to its larger work as a whole. And that's maddening as an introductory book to understanding class. Like that's
with the exception of what is it like chapters 1, 2, and 6. With the exception of like the meta theory stuff, this is more like of an episodic book. Yeah. Like
yeah. So that's both important to note, but it's also like then the book is actually misleading to what it does, except in 3 chapters.
This is someone towards the end of his life now, we know, whose life's work on class, who he had it worked out very systematically, became unsatisfying to him, and he was trying to rethink it. So
I interviewed him around this time. I lost the interview, and the reason why I didn't publish it and why it was able to be lost is because when he tried to explain this to me in Omoksahu, it was an incoherent fucking mess.
Mm-hmm.
Like I had no idea what his framework was. Yeah. He it was like concentric circles within, and I'm one of those people who accepts that you can have multiple class frameworks operational, and as long as you are clear which ones you're using, but like it was maddeningly complicated what he was trying to work out, and also weirdly not empirical. And that's not the case for Wright's early work. Wright's early work, even though I think some of his categorizations are basically exist for the parsimony of having a clean flowchart.
Yeah, no,
they are empirical.
I'm just going to put it out here as someone who loves philosophy. The point of writing anything down instrumentally is to defend a class division. So I think this is probably pretty much the hardest thing to study in all of thought. So yeah, I'll concede that. I'll concede all of this. But
it's just important to know for reading the book, if I'm just supposed to read this as an eminent critique of Sorensen, it's different than I'm trying to read this as creating a larger argument for multiple frameworks of class.
This is related to his defense of exploitation in general, and he's scaling. So to connect it, like he has to drastically scale back from the labor theory of value and his missteps with Romer to defend the core of Marxian exploitation from absurd fucking conclusions. And defining things this neatly and this simply at least allows you to restore just some of the basic conclusions of a Marxist, critique of exploitation, at all. And that was necessary. If his usage of rent isn't impressive because he's accepting a neoclassical framework, but at least you can say that capitalist exploitation happens in perfect competition,
right?
Because it's an inherent part of
fair enough. But that's like I just find
that's the stakes.
I think if you slip towards the stake of where workers organize to protect themselves from exploitation, that a Marxist is calling that movement to increase their labor power a rent. I just find that problematic. This is the sentence, like pretty much.
Sure.
I'll read it here. It's in the last page. I know we're going to get here, but I'll read it now because it's what we're talking about. The rent component of the solidarity wage, like the more general wage premium of employment rents, should therefore in general be thought of as a mitigation of capitalist exploitation rather than a form of exploitation in its own right. So he has, but he still is calling these rents. Like he's like one of the people he quotes in here is fucking Janet Yellen. She's the fucking Fed chairman. Like, you know what I mean?
I hear you. I think we're putting emphasis in different places here. The point that's most interesting to me is that you call it a rent, you call it whatever you want. It's not exploitation. It's a defense against exploitation.
Well, I don't know. Actually, it says it's a mitigation of capitalist exploitation. It does not say that it is not exploitation.
It does say it's rather than a form of exploitation in its own right.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, he does go through the argument.
It's not a form of exploitation, which is a reversal of a position that he would have had earlier following Romer.
But
this is progress for right.
But he's essentially saying it's a form of rent, and not a battle over labor power. One of the most basic.
No, he's saying the battle
Marxism.
over labor power is potentially like you could describe that as rent. And I think when you think about wage differentials between working classes in different countries, like eventually you're going to stumble upon some kind of concept.
Can I point out why this is actually a big deal, though? Because this is a difference. This conception of rents as a mitigation of capitalist exploitation would actually lead one to a conclusion that is sympathetic to both Keynesian and market socialist economic programs, whereas someone taking a more pure market framework would have to, a more pure Marxist framework would have to reject this language because it would imply stuff like self-exploitation doesn't exist and stuff like that. Like there are philosophical assumptions that cut against Marxism fundamentally. And even in framing it like this,
and even a lack of clarity, like it doesn't seem to be defined correctly from an analytical Marxist point of view. You can't say they're being exploited, and then they reduce their exploitation, but that's a rent.
From a classical Marxist point of view, you're right. From an analytical Marxist point of view, it's all fucking neoclassical economics, which is the problem with a lot of analytical Marxist modeling.
Okay, I see why we're gonna have it. We're just never gonna get past this with this. So let's
I think we agree.
This is a fundamental defect of analytical Marxism is that it's based on neoclassical economics.
Yeah.
I'll never give you a different read than that.
Yes, but, and the Georgists are in the.
You got the Georgists in the chat.
Are in the chat. No,
thank God.
I actually think
we miss you.
It's relevant.
We miss you.
So, because the Georgists actually hold a proto version of neoclassical exploitation because they're liberals. So
wait, Georgists in the chat is the solidarity wage being described here as a rent, or can working class national differentials be considered or I don't know. I think it's perfectly clear that you could think of these as a rent when you deal with like guild unions or like professionals or something, and it's not as morally aberrant to think of it that way, even if it is neoclassical thinking.
Well, I think like Keynes is the father or is the son of George. Really, it's about killing the rentier. So like you're gonna look at George and you look at Keynes and like it's a kind of it's a nicer version to be living under of capitalism, but it's still fucking capitalism. Let's get it straight. But welcome back to the chat, D. Bruce. Okay. Always in there.
Bruce says the economic rent of land is the locus of exploitation. There it is.
Yeah, there you go.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so he agrees with Sorensen, as I suspected.
Yeah, and thank you for coming to draw some battle lines, man, because we're over here doing neoclassical Marxist purge infighting, while the Georgists are out here being like, yeah, fucking rent is exploitation. Like
the analytical Marxists are going to be purged by time soon enough. So let's.
You can't be purged by something that doesn't exist. See, you can't have analytical Marxists can't have a black hole because you need space-time to warp. I can't see space-time.
You know, Esri, like we really should, like at that point when you said that point, we should stop the reading group and discontinue it from now on. Like we've lost.
I tricked you into reading someone who doesn't share all of our assumptions.
Oh God. Right.
Just
like,
wait till we get to the politics.
we got to number.
Do
we get to number 2? Let's get through some more of these.
Let's get through those. Let's like try to get through this 6 years.
I thought this chapter. I said we'll do this easy. We'll get. There's only 14, 15 slides.
No. Like honestly, Tom, if it had been Derek and yourself and me, we would have gone through this fast. But we
would just be like, "This is shit." Moving on.
Yeah, we've introduced a dialectic into this process.
Whatever. Hey, look, it took you like what 3? It took you that whole calculus course to get through chapter 3. So now you want to hear it. Like I wasn't there, and you all agreed. Yeah, this guy's basically fucking.
We disagreed on
von
other
Neumann
things,
here.
Actually.
What did I didn't catch those? What did you disagree on?
We disagreed on other.
Let's not start that.
All right, cut it. Cut this part out. I just want
on the
to.
live stream. Go to YouTube. Wait, listen to the fucking live stream. Right.
Yeah, let's finish the slide.
I'll listen to it when it's edited, man. Jeez.
Number 3. Ezra, you're reading them.
Yeah. Hold on. Number 3. The existence of a high minimum wage increases exploitation in a society and renders workers at or near the minimum wage an exploiting class.
Again, this follows from neoclassical welfare economics, which argues that perfect competition produces the best outcome for everyone possible. There's no way that you could possibly optimize beyond that, and therefore, any minimum wage setting is going to reduce the total utility enjoyed by society as a whole. And neoclassicals are all about producing the best of all possible worlds.
We're dealing with a body of theory which calls the minimum wage exploitative. Like if your Marxist morals are burning at this, it shouldn't be at, we've analytically defined rent like the neoclassicals, and we're not allowing it to.
Both. The answer is both.
I don't know.
Although
Rights being more dialectical than you. Rights allowing the definition of rents to emerge from a dialectic.
Like, one thing we can't accuse Wright of is being more dialectical than me. Like, come on, the fuck.
In this case, you're asking for a direct stipulation of rent in a different way instead of just dealing with an interlocutor. That's very classically the difference.
You're talking about a correct fucking definition, like of a force or a
Tom, the correct definition and the dialectical definition are not necessarily the same. When you start, as we already said,
I don't want to hear.
As we already said, Tom, if you are starting from neoclassical assumptions and you're doing an imminent critique, you could be led to wrong conclusions.
All right, so let's actually. I do want to point out, though, this is interesting. I also find this a laughable assertion. But I find it interesting that there's a lot of Marxist critique of minimum wage for a lot of different reasons. And when I have stated it before, when I've stated Marxist critiques of minimum wage, full employment would be better than a minimum wage for a variety of reasons, blah, 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 more elastic, it moves with market. People actually read me as making this point. I have been told by both right-wingers and left-wingers that I was actually arguing that minimum wage was exploitative, when I was actually kind of pointing out that it is inefficient and it's inelastic and
which people might have interpreted as being a rent argument, which people might have interpreted as being an exploitation argument,
right? Which under neoclassical assumptions would be a valid reading. I'm not a neoclassicalist, and I don't have those because the irony of this is, you'll notice the most likely person to impose rents according to Sorensen's framework is at the bottom of the framework almost over and over and over again, as if the bottom of the framework has the ability to set monopoly power, which is absurd.
It's the parasites at the bottom holding down the great men of history. It's
who would also lift them up if they only let them.
Yeah,
there are kind of flavors of this argument in Marx's vitriolic criticisms of the lumpen proletariat in the 18th Brumaire, but I don't think it follows into any of his political economy.
Sorry, Derek.
Yeah,
I kicked you out of the room for that comment just for like a second. I thought it deserved it.
No, but Kyle, just to in dialogue with you, then Marx became the big head of an ideology of a global union movement that wasn't always the most inclusive thing in the world, and sometimes was trying to cleave itself off from an undesirable population. In the American labor movement, and the Israeli labor movement comes to mind, like South African labor movement, like sometimes those dynamics became really important and observable. Maybe that's why I'm not so morally opposed to abstracting the rent framework in the neoclassical way, because I think it helps. It can help you understand how trade union consciousness can become this reformist kind of hoarder strategy.
But the one thing I will say that all those strategies share that some of these strategies don't, even in the argument made by Wright refuting them, is monopoly power granted by the state, which the trade unions have won. That's not true necessarily in a solidarity. It is true in minimum wage, but it's not true in a solidarity wage. So even then, I'm always like, well, there are some valid points being made in some of this framework if you applied it to the way we talk about national proletariats trying to get up. In fact, Marx actually lists that as the fourth form of alienation, the worker from the worker. But it is misleading to think about that happening organically, socially, versus workers' ties to government officials through class collaboration being able to impose that by government policy fiat, which to me is a kind of difference even for a Marxist.
And this is where Marxists are so often misunderstood as right wingers, because the critique is so far outside of the coordinates of normal political debate, which is within the confines of the action of the state, that the arguments end up looking like right-wing arguments at first glance because they don't agree with what Keynesians say at any level.
It's a horseshoe theory. Theory is the same. Ethical injunctions are different. Theory is not really the same, but it has more in common than the center, which is, by the way, fracturing. So
right. Well, I mean, it
cannot hold.
I have been accused by Keynesians and even other Marxists of being a right winger for making classical Marxist arguments.
Me too. Yeah. So what are you gonna do? Speaking of right wing arguments, here's a fourth startling conclusion. So 4, a strong welfare state also increases exploitation. Welfare recipients are an exploiting class.
Mm-hmm. This was a weaponized ideology in the 90s.
Yep.
Yeah,
and to this day.
Yeah. But I mean, that was the high watermark in my lifetime of attacking welfare moms and that kind of stuff.
It seems to be still perfectly popular in Britain right now, though.
Yeah. No, it flows directly from a theory of rents as neoclassical rents as exploitation. Yeah.
And it's also basically Nietzsche's critique of Marx.
Yeah, it is actually.
What would the chances be that in America you could have a president like Boris Johnson, who's got baby mamas all over the place with kids? Everybody knows he's got about 6 or 7 kids from different women.
Trump.
Did Trump have baby mom? Does he have baby mamas?
He had multiple kids and multiple family sets.
That's in marriages.
That's true. Although he didn't ever deny he had an affair with a porn star, and it didn't matter. He didn't even use the evangelical support. So.
There's also some assault claims and stuff. So,
maybe, that's
quite a few actually.
Yeah, quite a few assault claims. So, I didn't know that about Boris Johnson. though. That's interesting. It's out of wedlock, it would be more scandalous in America. Although you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it wouldn't have mattered for Trump. The only thing that seemed to matter for Trump was mismanaging the COVID economy, and racism exists?
Boris has an unknown number of children. The press don't say how many children he has because they don't know how many he has.
Yeah, I knew that.
So this is a Genghis Khan situation.
Yes. I mean, Boris Johnson to me actually in many ways out-Trumps Trump. He just He's just,
He's posh. He's actually posh.
he's
You
posh.
know. Yeah.
The power of old money, you know?
Yeah, no, that's totally it.
The cultural staying power of old money to not burn up, right?
Boris Johnson's like great granny or something was the mistress of like one of the Prussian, the heir to the Prussian throne. And
Well, this is some Fall of Eagles shit.
Yeah, like, and I think his like their parents went and like complained to the King of Prussia that basically he's been gallivanting around with my daughter, blah 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 blah, and you're not marrying him. And I don't know if she was pregnant. She might have gotten pregnant, and they basically gave them a whole load of silver fucking cutlery and shit, like kind of this like really expensive like dinner set from the royal palace, and they had it apparently as their family heirloom until they needed to sell it like about 100 or like I think like 50 years ago. So
literally selling the family silver.
Like literally sold the family silver, yeah.
All right, so let's I guess more startling conclusions. Moving on. No cheap segue. This is science, people. Number 5. The increase in inequality of the last 2 decades reflect a reduction in rents. The increase in inequality is very much driven by an increase in wages and earnings of the highest paid, and stagnation or decline for others. The stagnation and decline follow from rent destruction.
So the reason everything's getting more and more unequal is that all these low lives on their good welfare checks and their fucking good minimum wage or union rents.
They're somehow making the rich richer.
Yeah. Now they're making the rich richer because they're not being fucking getting them anymore. Yeah. The neoliberal period has smashed those unjust rents, and now the rightful fucking rich are rich as they are.
Yeah, smashed those neoclassical rents and allowed classical rents to fucking really skyrocket. Yeah.
This is also a confusion that's perpetuated by the tendency of capitalists to take a considerable amount of their income as wages. So that was it. That was a kind of political strategy that was pursued. And Sorensen is basically like doing work for them here by confusing the rise in executive compensation, or like not really conflating, but like putting these two things next to each other to make them seem similar, like welfare income and rises in executive compensation as being the drivers of the rise in inequality.
And number 6, this all implies less exploitation in the system under neoliberal, deregulated labor markets, and thus a move towards classless society.
Dun,
Ever closer to you.
I will put an asterisk on this, and Sorensen does basically just say, yeah, maybe eliminating rents is actually really bad and immoral. Maybe we need rents and exploitation.
Yeah,
which
here we
I
go.
think,
Let's read these.
Yeah.
Finish these 3 here.
So reducing exploitation in capitalist societies may in fact be a bad thing. Nothing guarantees that efficient labor markets create good lives. Rents are required in modern society to provide decent standards of living for the poorest part of the population. These rents are provided from the state in the form of income support and other welfare goods. The elimination of class and exploitation increases human misery, and thus a humane capitalist society is one that fosters certain kinds of antagonistic class interests, particularly by strengthening state-sanctioned forms of exploitation.
So he edgelords the edgelords by saying the neoclassicals are right, but we still need more exploitation, more of it, in fact. But by exploitation, we mean Sweden-level social democracy.
I'm telling you, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get a fucking professorship in Harvard University.
Academia, especially gee whiz, social reality is nothing like you plebs think kinds of academia. There's certainly a fetish for these, startling, contrarian,
counterintuitives.
conclusions.
Novelty gets tenure.
Who could have thought?
I will say this is where, from the Soviet Union to, Western academia to Twitter, there's a sort of maybe borderline personality disorder selecting thing where you will embolden voices that are trying to find the most inflammatory, thing to say in a situation, and then, you know, instrumentally they will try to construct it in the most rigorous and convincing way, and you have a sort of nihilist engine that displaces your ability to make sense of these matters. It is like the way that like modernity, and you could call this a bourgeois aspect, and if you do, then the Soviet Union has a decent amount of bourgeois, you know, in this abstract sense. This affect, this sort of thing that occurs, I like to appreciate it, and how it feels so big. It feels so big in how many areas of life it colonizes, if you know what I mean. And that is partially due to my class position, and if I wasn't as academically oriented, I might not be around it as much. But like, it's something that's really, you know, it's something that I almost take for granted in dealing with people of my class background.
Yeah, I want to just sort of highlight a couple things on the last point here. This point about the elimination of class and exploitation increases human misery. I think there's like two things you can see here. One is that Sorensen has managed to loop back from the classical liberal position to the Keynesian position, or, you know, I guess the right socialist position, right? And the other thing is that this probably has some similarities to the arguments over like whether a transition to communism would cause a reduction, an interim reduction in utility and an increase in human suffering until you return to a higher level of prosperity.
That's interesting. The transition trough debate. You know, I didn't make that connection because what's underneath the language is so different. Like,
yeah, but this is like a Keynesian argument against revolution.
Yeah, it is. It's we'll accept all the values of the neoliberal classical liberals. They're all true, but they're bad. So we need our Keynesian welfare state to rule in perpetuity, because any reduction of exploitation, either in the neoliberal way, but also kind of in the Marxist way, we're not going to say that, but we're going to strongly imply it by equating the language together, will lead to more suffering and misery, while we can live forever in sweet utopia. By the way, Joseph Heath, the Canadian philosopher, economist, he's a philosopher who writes about economics, makes this argument for Canada being the ideal society on the planet. So I just wanted to bring that up for Kyle, because he does this exact argument almost.
But it's even worse for me though, because he has done that whole loop back to Keynesianism, right? But what has he done? Instead of saying like Keynes is saying, oh, you know, the bad rentier, and he's going like, no, we should like increase like the rentier, because like the rentier is good. So it actually gives the right wingers a look at what the left wingers are saying and say, look what they're saying, we want to increase rents. It's like, it's so fucked up, it's unbelievable.
No, but
it's closer to the neo-Keynesian position than to Keynes. Yeah.
Well, not only this, but it's the most effective strategy. Like there's a pattern in Romer's work where at first he just rejects the category of exploitation. He writes a paper, you know, why should Marxists be interested in exploitation? He basically takes a deflationary angle. But one of the best career decisions of Romer's life is to be like, no, you know what? Fuck it. I'm gonna redefine exploitation. You know, I'm gonna do it like. And actually, when Romer comes up in this piece, he looks pretty goddamn good compared to Sorensen, I have to say. But that's something that neoclassicals did altogether. There's a point where, you know, exploitation was simply a topic to be suppressed, but neoclassicals were kind of brilliant in saying, no. I think we can use this word. I think we can make something useful of this. And so now, we have the sober, adult, sociological, I've read Foucault, I know everything isn't going to work out kind of conclusion that we are condemned to live in societies with exploitation. And in fact, like, maybe it's good, maybe it's fine, or maybe it's ambiguous. I don't know. We shouldn't be thinking about societies without exploitation.
Yeah, these are the people who read Foucault and then decide that, like, well, he was right about Bentham, but the Panopticon's actually really good.
Yeah, maybe it'll keep the Nazis in check.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I mean, the Foucault analogy is perfect because honestly, Foucault's actual arguments are closer to like right libertarian ones about like all institutions are bad.
Yeah, and just flips the values.
Right, and then his fans are all like, yeah, but institutions though. I mean, and this is the same argument. Like, I mean, it's the same structural argument. It's like the neoclassicals are right about rents, but how unjust would it be if we actually had the utopia of perfect competition? It might be kind of bad.
It's so ridiculous because it doesn't even really acknowledge the neoclassical point of, like, it doesn't really even agree with neoclassical welfare economics is what I guess I'm saying. Is like, it accepts the premises of perfect competition, but then disagrees with the welfare economics that follow from them.
It's in some ways a very novel position.
Can you expand on the welfare economics there a bit?
Well, because if you agree with perfect competition, you say it's a possible thing, right? Like that it has some descriptive value, it has normative value, because in perfect competition, there's no classes, there's no exploitation, and it's literally impossible to increase the utility of the society in aggregate. There's no thing you could do that would possibly increase it. And anything you would do to change that would decrease the utility. And he's saying, no, actually, getting to perfect competition would be so damaging that it's morally abhorrent. And kind of rejecting the idea of any kind of transition to that position. So he's saying we have to accept the suboptimal world.
Yes.
Because it's 100% that
Gosplan forever. Gosplan forever.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's like, original sin. Like we live in a fallen universe. We cannot actually reach heaven, and so therefore Catholicism must rule for 1,000,000 years. That kind of argument, right? Like we need the church on earth to keep us in line because we live in a fallen world.
If we're in a fallen universe, which is the sluttiest galaxy? That's what I want to know. Andromeda?
No comment. I know, and I'm not telling you.
I've been there, and it's a hell of a place. Okay. This is actually kind of, I know you're going to get 6 slides in, but it's kind of the logical place to quit on this session, because we're going to go then to Wright's taking them down. He does disagree with him. Let's be fair to Wright.
Wright comes to the right conclusions by my standards, but for bad reasons.
We'll have to talk about whether his argument can even hold up on neoclassical grounds, like whether there's actually deductive problems where he makes moves that completely disagree with his premises.
I don't really think, right, like as he gets older and as he's abandoning the framework that he built around Romer, I think he's maybe too much of a sociologist to really hold on to those things for that long.
What I mean is that I had a really hard time reading Wright's sort of corrective and critique here, because I ran into a similar problem that I had in economics, where it was like, I'm trying to explain myself here. I think the thing is, Wright is establishing this background by talking about Sorensen, and then he's going on to make a counter argument. And at the points where it seemed to me like his argument was deviating from his premises, I got into that kind of weird gaslighty place where it's like, but do these arguments have any kind of logical basis to them? Like, I don't know. There's just so much in social sciences where, like, for example, Piketty accepts neoclassical premises and then provides an argument that does not match them.
Right.
And then because his argument is appealing to some people, they will accept the argument even though it's premised on incompatible premises. And then you get into that position where you are holding a political position in the public sphere, and your logical foundation can so easily be cut out under you by the neoclassicals because the argument doesn't actually agree with its premises.
Right.
This is what happened with the labor theory of value.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of. It's probably what happened with Romer and Wright and the analytical Marxists, right?
You're totally right. That happens with the classical analytical Marxist school. But it also happens with the reconstruction of the labor theory of value on like grounds that destroy it. Like,
totally, completely.
Yeah, like Borkovich or all the people who try to recapitulate it against Bombard, but not by going back into Marx, but by going like
forward into equilibrium theory.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, I agree with that. Yes. But what's interesting is like, yeah, you're right. That's a premises. I'm trying to justify a conclusion, air hop, proctor hop, but the premises I've accepted, swallow it whole.
Yeah, you could just the economists from the high church can just come out and own you, like what happened to Piketty, where it was like, I released this book, everyone's talking about it, and then the neoclassicals came out and said, well, yeah, actually, but your foundations don't agree with this, so fuck off.
I hear what you're saying. I have the book where Romer, you know, in this kind of showy mathematical economist set, you know, I'm doing set theory kind of way. Like, I have the book here. It's a general theory of exploitation in class, where like the description of capitalist exploitation that he ends up with, like formally, is still it's still in agreement with Romer's principles. And even though I said he's deviated from Romer's position a bit, there is some common ground here. And so there, like that part is derived from its premises. It's formally proven.
Yeah, I really just mean in terms of like, you know, as we sort of said, like we have to take this chapter as a one-off. I'm just saying the premises he introduces at the beginning of the chapter with Sorensen and then goes on to do the critique, they don't really square. So I can't really comment on Wright's broader work. Just that's what bugged me about this chapter.
Maybe I'm not zeroing in on the arguments and like the premises that you're talking about. So we'll have to get into that because I want to. We should flesh out like what's not adding up there, because I do think that he's skeptical of the imaginary world being constructed in order to argue any of this. But I mean, just from the way that he's talking, like I'm only loosely paraphrasing this, like in this imaginary situation. I'm not actually sure where he ends up towards the end of his life. I know where he was at in the middle of his life, and it was probably, you know, not being very critical of a lot of this stuff. So I'm open to you just being like right about this, and you know, me not like adding up some of the parts that, you know, aren't formally proven in a book over here.
We got to get into it, and that's for next time. Into it.
Yeah, that's for next time.
And I might be wrong because, like, again, I was reading this with a lot of emotional reaction.
Join the club.
Join the club. No, that's okay though. Like, I don't want to continue the gaslight of neoclassical economics. Like, I also actually felt I never thought of it as gaslighting, but I did have the same kind of like, I don't know, like talking to community college trots about things or something. Like,
well, yeah,
you get into this parallel intellectual dimension.
For me, it was the way they defined rationality was so fucking circular that there was no way to ever disprove. There was no way for something to be not rational. And I was like, well, from a philosophical suspicion, then rational, it has no distinction. Like, it doesn't mean anything. Like, if by rational, if my preference is rational because it's my preference, and my preference is expressed because I do it no matter what, then
it's rational, baby.
It's rational, but that there's no way that anything that ever happens could be irrational by definition. So
yeah, it's like a worse version of the rational is real.
Yeah, there is that school, but a lot of the neoclassical assumption conditions are actually so, like, for some of the first like forms of neoclassical like rationality are so like restrictive that like most people don't meet it and are doing the economically irrational thing. So that wave of people that are like everything's rational are like,
Yeah, they're responding to the hyper.
Mhm.
yeah,
But
it's a very broken debate. It is because of the false premises. You can't, and the ideological premises. Like it's just like I don't know how else to say this. I don't mean ideology in the Althusserian way or in the liberal way where everybody has an ideology. No. I mean like a pernicious post hoc ergo propter hoc way of thinking, back thinking from below, making your conclusion, doing your assumption, and then backfilling. The stuff of critical theory. Like that's why this stuff is so hard to parse. That's why it's gaslighty. It's studying class is the final boss of thought.
Yeah.
Well, what about consciousness? Sorry.